In the dusty cobblestone streets of Mexico City in 1798, when the cathedral bells of the Metropolitan Cathedral barely finished their 5 a.m. toll, no one could have imagined that an African woman, her back scarred by slavery and the merciless whip, would become the most feared figure in all of New Spain. Her name was Yamaya Oken, but history would remember her as La Bruja de las Siete Casas, the Witch of the Seven Houses. The morning mist still clung to the Plaza Mayor like a shroud when the first body was discovered on that June morning. Don Fernando de Iturragare Arostegui, heir to one of the oldest and most powerful fortunes in the colony, was found dead in his opulent bedchamber at the age of 23. His silk sheets were tangled around his body as if he had thrashed violently in his final moments. His eyes were open, pupils dilated to the point where almost no iris remained, staring at the ornately painted ceiling above him. His mouth was twisted in a silent scream of absolute terror, frozen in his final expression of horror at something only he could see. The family physician, Dr. Eugenio Valdez, a man educated at the University of Salamanca and considered one of the finest medical minds in New Spain, examined the body with growing bewilderment. There were no marks of violence on Don Fernando's pale skin. No bruises around the throat to suggest strangulation. No evidence of stabbing or poisoning. His lips weren't blue, there was no characteristic smell of bitter almonds or arsenic about him, no signs of the convulsions that typically accompany toxic death. His heart had simply stopped beating, as if pure terror alone had been enough to kill him. Dr. Valdez would write in his private journal that night, in shaking handwriting that betrayed his own fear, "I have examined hundreds of corpses in my career, but never one like this." It is as if Don Fernando saw death itself approaching and his heart simply surrendered to fear. God help us if there are more like this. But that was only the beginning. That first death was merely the opening note in a symphony of destruction that would play out over the next decade, dismantling the power structure of colonial Mexico one family at a time. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us what country or city you're watching from. It really helps us know our community. To understand how Yamaya Oken became the instrument of such devastating retribution, how a single enslaved woman could bring down 7 of the most powerful families in New Spain, we must travel back 12 years, to the year 1786, and to a place very different from the refined salons of Mexico City. The port of Veracruz in 1786 was the gateway to New Spain, where ships from Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean brought goods and human cargo to feed the insatiable appetite of the colonial economy. It was a place of brutal heat and casual cruelty, where enslaved Africans were unloaded like cattle and sold to the highest bidder, their humanity denied by law, by custom, by the very structure of society itself. On a sweltering day in August, when the sun turned the stone buildings into ovens and the humid air felt thick enough to chew, a Portuguese slave ship called Nossa Senhora de Conceição dropped anchor in Veracruz harbor. In its hold were the survivors of a voyage that had begun 3 months earlier on the coast of what Europeans called the Slave Coast, in the Bight of Benin, in the land of the Yoruba people. Among those survivors was a girl of 14 who would one day be known as Yamaya Oken, though that was not the name she bore when she was torn from her village. Her birth name was lost to history, erased by the violence of the slavers who considered names unimportant for property. She had been born in a village where her grandmother was a respected priestess of Yamaya, the Orisha who ruled the ocean, who was mother of all life, who could be as nurturing as a calm sea or as destructive as a hurricane. Her grandfather had been a priest of Oken, the Orisha of rivers and sweet water, of love and sensuality, of the power that flows rather than crashes. The girl had been raised in the old traditions, learning the prayers in Yoruba, learning how to identify the sacred herbs, learning to feel the presence of the spirits in the natural world around her. That world ended on a morning when raiders came, men from a rival kingdom, armed with European guns purchased with the profits from previous raids. They came at dawn when the cooking fires were just being lit and most of the village was still half asleep. The girl watched, hidden in a storage hut where her mother had shoved her at the first sound of gunfire, as her father was shot trying to defend the village. She watched as her mother was clubbed unconscious. She watched as her 3 younger brothers, all under the age of 10, were killed because young children didn't survive the voyage well and weren't worth the cost of feeding. She watched all of this through gaps in the woven wall of the storage hut, biting her hand to keep from screaming, tasting her own blood as her teeth cut into her palm, while her world collapsed into nightmare. The raiders took everyone who looked strong enough to survive the march to the coast, about 40 people from her village including the girl. They were chained neck to neck in a coffle, a line of human beings linked like beasts, and forced to walk for 17 days through forest and savanna to the coast, where European traders waited with their ships. During that march, the girl learned that survival required retreat, not physical retreat, which was impossible when you were chained to other captives, but mental retreat into a place deep inside where the spirits of her grandmother and grandfather still lived, where they whispered to her that she must endure, that she must survive, that she had a purpose even if she couldn't yet see what it was. When they reached the coast and she saw the slave ships for the first time, massive vessels with holds designed to pack human beings as tightly as possible to maximize profit, she understood that she was entering a new kind of hell. The Middle Passage, as Europeans euphemistically called it, was 3 months of horror that defied description. The girl was chained in a space so small she couldn't sit up, lying in her own waist and the waist of the women chained around her. The air was so foul that breathing felt like drowning. The darkness was absolute except when the hatches opened and guards came down to throw buckets of seawater on the captives or to drag away the bodies of those who had died in the night. Of the 400 captives who boarded Nossa Senhora de Conceição in Africa, only 212 survived to see the coast of New Spain. The rest died from disease, dehydration, despair, or the casual brutality of the crew. Bodies were thrown overboard daily, consigned to the ocean without ceremony, food for the sharks that followed the slave ships across the Atlantic like an escort of demons. The girl survived by going deeper into that mental place where her grandparents waited. During the worst moments, when death seemed preferable to one more minute of suffering, she would hear her grandmother's voice singing the old prayers to Yamaya, asking the Ocean Mother for protection. She would hear her grandfather chanting invocations to Oken, calling on the sweet water goddess to sustain life. And somehow, impossibly, she endured. When the ship finally docked in Veracruz and the survivors were brought up on deck, blinking in the painful sunlight after months in darkness, the girl looked out at this new world and felt the Orishas speaking to her. Not in words, but in a deep knowing that settled into her bones. She had been kept alive for a reason. Her suffering had a purpose. The spirits had not abandoned her, they were preparing her for something. The slave market in Veracruz was held in a large plaza near the docks, where human beings were displayed on wooden platforms while wealthy colonists examined them like livestock, checking their teeth, their muscles, looking for signs of disease or weakness. The girl stood on that platform, still weak from the voyage, her body showing every rib, her eyes hollow but somehow still burning with a fierce will to live. She was purchased by Don Rodrigo Velasco de Mendoza, a wealthy merchant from Mexico City who needed domestic slaves for his household. Don Rodrigo was 60 years old, a widower with 3 adult sons, a man whose fortune had been built on the labor of enslaved Africans and indigenous people working his sugar plantations in the state of Morelos. He paid 300 pesos for the girl, a reasonable price for a young female slave who could be trained for household work and would provide many years of service. The journey from Veracruz to Mexico City took 5 days by wagon, traveling the royal road that connected the port to the capital. The girl, now the legal property of Don Rodrigo Velasco de Mendoza, recorded in his books of accounts like any other asset, rode in the back of a wagon with other supplies. She had been given the name Maria by the priest who performed a cursory baptism before they left Veracruz, but she refused to answer to it. She had decided during the voyage that she would keep her true name hidden, that she would take the names of her grandmothers and grandfathers Orishas as her own identity, even if only in her mind. She would be Yamaya Oken, daughter of the ocean and the river, and that name would be her secret power. Mexico City in 1786 was the capital of New Spain, a glittering jewel of colonial power built on the ruins of the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish had demolished the indigenous city and erected their own in its place, a European city transplanted to the New World, with Baroque churches, ornate palaces, and grand plazas that rivaled anything in Madrid or Seville. But beneath that European veneer was a society built on a strict racial hierarchy that determined every aspect of life. At the top were the peninsulars, those born in Spain who held all the highest positions in government and church. Below them were the criollos, those of Spanish blood born in the Americas, who controlled most of the wealth but resented their exclusion from the highest offices. Below them were the various castas, mixed-race people of Spanish, indigenous, and African ancestry, categorized in an elaborate system of classifications that determined their legal rights and social status. And at the bottom, with no rights at all, were the enslaved, Africans and their descendants, indigenous people forced into labor, human beings legally classified as property. The Velasco de Mendoza family was one of 7 great houses that dominated Mexico City society. These families, the Velasco de Mendoza, the Iturragare Arostegui, the Salcedo y Montemayor, the Cortázar Benavides, the Obregón Villarreal, the Dávalos Cervantes, and the Zúñiga Fonseca, traced their lineage back to the conquistadors who had helped Hernán Cortés conquer Mexico in 1521. They owned vast haciendas, silver mines, textile workshops. They controlled the import-export trade with Spain. They were intermarried, their children forming alliances that consolidated wealth and power. They attended the same masses at the Metropolitan Cathedral, where they occupied reserved pews. They dined with the viceroy in his palace. They hosted the archbishop in their private chapels. They considered themselves a breed apart, chosen by God and circumstance to rule over the darker-skinned masses of New Spain. These were the 7 houses that would fall. These were the families that Yamaya Ocan would systematically destroy, leaving not a single heir to carry on their bloodlines. The Velasco de Mendoza mansion was located near the Alameda Central Park, a 3-story Baroque palace with carved stone balconies, ornate iron grillwork, and an interior courtyard with a fountain surrounded by orange trees that perfumed the air with their blossoms. The house was a statement of wealth and power, designed to impress and intimidate. Yamaya was assigned to work in the kitchen, a vast room with high ceilings, massive fireplaces, and walls lined with copper pots and ceramic vessels. The head cook was an older indigenous woman named Maria de la Cruz, a Nahua woman from a village in the Valley of Mexico who had been working in wealthy households since she was 12 years old, nearly 40 years earlier. Maria took one look at the skeletal African girl who spoke no Spanish and showed up in her kitchen, and her heart broke with pity. She had seen too much suffering in her life, had lost too many of her own people to the diseases and brutalities of colonial rule, to turn away from someone in need. She took Yamaya under her protection, teaching her Spanish mixed with Nahuatl words, teaching her how to prepare the elaborate meals the family demanded. The Velasco household required food that demonstrated their wealth, complex moles that took 3 days to prepare, using dozens of ingredients including chocolate, chilies, spices imported from Asia. Chiles en nogada, the elaborate dish of poblano peppers stuffed with picadillo and covered in walnut sauce that was served during patriotic celebrations. Cochinita pibil, the Yucatecan specialty of pork marinated in achiote and sour orange, wrapped in banana leaves and slow-cooked. Pan de muerto during Day of the Dead celebrations, the sweet bread decorated with bone-shaped pieces of dough. These meals required endless hours of preparation, of grinding spices on stone metates, of chopping vegetables, of stirring pots over fires that turned the kitchen into an inferno during the hottest months. The kitchen served a household of 23 people. Don Rodrigo, his 3 adult sons and their families, various poor relations who lived on the family's charity, and the servants and slaves who kept the household running. In return for Maria's kindness, Yamaya helped with the grinding, the chopping, the endless physical labor. And at night, in the tiny room she shared with 3 other enslaved women in the servants' quarters behind the main house, a room barely large enough for 4 sleeping mats on the floor, she would lie awake and whisper the prayers her grandmother had taught her. She prayed in Yoruba, the language of her people, keeping the words alive in her mouth even though there was no one else who understood them. She called on Yamaya, asking the ocean mother for strength. She called on Ocan, asking the river goddess for the ability to flow around obstacles. She called on Eligua, the Orisha of crossroads and choices, asking him to show her a path forward. She called on Ashen, the warrior king, asking for the courage to endure. And slowly over the first 2 years she felt the spirits responding. Not in dramatic ways but in small things. A dream that warned her when one of the other slaves was planning to steal her meager possessions. A sudden intuition that kept her from eating food that later made everyone else sick. A sense of when Don Rodrigo was in a dangerous mood and she should stay out of sight. The first 2 years were bearable because she kept her head down, did her work without complaint, and avoided drawing attention to herself. She learned to become almost invisible, the way enslaved people learned to survive in a world where visibility could be dangerous. But in 1788, everything changed in a way that would set in motion the destruction of the 7 houses. Don Rodrigo's youngest son, Carlos, returned from Spain in March of that year. He had been studying law at the University of Salamanca, that ancient institution where Spanish nobles sent their sons to acquire the education befitting their class. Carlos was 26 years old when he returned, tall and slender, with the pale skin that came from generations of Spanish blood carefully kept pure through strategic marriages that avoided any mixing with indigenous or African lineages. He had his father's sharp features and aristocratic bearing, but where Don Rodrigo carried his power with a certain restraint born of age and experience, Carlos had all the arrogance of youth combined with the entitlement of someone who had never been told no, who had never faced any real consequences for his actions. Carlos noticed Yamaya within days of his return. By then she was 16 years old, no longer the skeletal girl who had arrived on the slave ship but a young woman whose body had filled out from Maria's generous portions. Her features, high cheekbones, full lips, dark skin that seemed to absorb light, represented everything forbidden and therefore fascinating to a young Spanish nobleman who had been taught that African people were inferior but whose base desires didn't respect the racial hierarchies his society insisted upon. He began finding excuses to come to the kitchen, asking for water when there were servants whose job it was to bring him whatever he wanted, requesting special dishes be prepared, then standing around watching while Yamaya worked, commenting on the heat, on the quality of the food, on trivial things, but always positioning himself close to her, his eyes following her movements with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Maria de la Cruz noticed immediately. She had lived in wealthy households long enough to recognize this pattern, had seen it play out too many times with too many young indigenous and African women. She pulled Yamaya aside one afternoon and spoke to her in a mixture of Spanish and Nahuatl, her voice urgent and afraid. "You must be careful with Don Carlos. Men like him, they believe we exist for their use. They take what they want and there is no justice for us. If he forces himself on you, there is nothing you can do. The law considers you his father's property, and he is his father's son. If you resist, you will be beaten or killed. If you submit, you will be broken. There is no good path when a master's son fixes his attention on a slave." Yamaya heard the truth in Maria's words, had already seen in Don Carlos's eyes what he intended. But her grandmother's voice whispered in her mind, "Endure. Survive. Your time will come." She tried to avoid him. She tried to be busy when he appeared, to position herself near other servants, to make sure she was never alone. But the mansion wasn't large enough to hide, and Carlos had all the time and power in the world. He could wait. He could arrange circumstances. He could engineer situations where she had no escape. It happened on a Thursday afternoon in late March of 1788, during the season of Lent when the Catholic calendar demanded fasting and prayer and abstinence from pleasure. The irony would not be lost on Yamaya in later years, that it happened during the holiest season of the Christian calendar, in a household that prided itself on its piety. The family had gone to the cathedral for afternoon mass. Most of the servants had been given permission to attend a different service at one of the neighborhood churches. Maria de la Cruz had asked Yamaya if she wanted to go, but Yamaya had declined, saying she preferred to use the quiet time to prepare vegetables for the evening meal. She was alone in the kitchen, sitting on a low stool with a basket of tomatillos, peeling away their papery husks, when Carlos entered through the door that connected the kitchen to the main house. She heard the door close and looked up to see him sliding the heavy bolt that locked it from the inside. Her heart began to race. She stood up, the basket spilling tomatillos across the stone floor. "Don Carlos, I need to finish this work." "The work can wait," he said, moving toward her with that casual confidence of someone who had never been denied anything. She backed away, looking for another exit, but the only other door led to the courtyard and he was between her and it. "Don Carlos, please, if someone finds us alone." "No one will find us. Everyone is at mass. It's just you and me, Maria." "My name is not Maria," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. It was the first time she had spoken those words aloud to anyone in this place. Carlos smiled, apparently amused by what he considered impudence. "Your name is whatever I say it is. Just like everything else about you. My father owns you, which means I own you. And I've decided I want to see what an African girl feels like." She tried to run, then tried to dart past him to the courtyard door, but he was faster. He grabbed her by the arm, his fingers digging into her flesh hard enough that she knew it would leave bruises. She fought, struggling against his grip, but he was stronger and had been trained since childhood in wrestling and swordsmanship, the martial skills of his class. He hit her across the face with his open hand, the blow hard enough to split her lip and make her head ring. She tasted blood. He hit her again and the world tilted. Then he was forcing her down onto the stone floor of the kitchen, his weight pinning her, and she heard her grandmother's voice screaming in her mind, but she couldn't form words, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but try to survive as he violated her on the cold floor while she bled from her split lip. When he finished, Carlos stood up and adjusted his clothing with the same casual air he might have after using the chamber pot. He looked down at Yamaya where she lay curled on the floor, and said in a conversational tone as if they were discussing the weather, "If you tell anyone about this, I'll have you whipped until your back is nothing but meat hanging from your bones. Do you understand me? My father will believe anything I tell him. Everyone will. You're nothing. A slave. Property. You have no voice here. So keep your mouth shut about this, or I'll make sure you regret it for however long you live after the whipping, which won't be long." Yamaya nodded, unable to speak, unable to do anything but signal her submission to save herself from worse. Carlos smiled, apparently satisfied, and left through the courtyard door, whistling a tune he'd probably learned in some Salamanca tavern. She lay on the kitchen floor for a long time after he left, bleeding, her body screaming with pain, her mind fracturing. This was what her grandmother had prepared her to survive? This was what the spirits had kept her alive for? To be raped on a kitchen floor by a boy who considered her less than human? But then she heard it, her grandmother's voice, clear as if the old woman were standing beside her. Not to survive this. To avenge it. To become the weapon that strikes back. The spirits did not preserve you to be a victim forever. They preserved you to be a reckoning. And in that moment, broken and bleeding on the cold stone floor, something changed in Yamaya Oken. She stopped being a victim waiting for rescue or for circumstances to change. She became something else, something patient and implacable and absolutely committed to the destruction of everyone who had done this to her, to everyone like them, to the entire system that made such violations possible. She pulled herself up, cleaned herself as best she could, and went back to work preparing the tomatillos, her hands steady even though everything inside her was screaming. That was the first time Carlos raped her, but it was not the last. He came back again and again over the following months, whenever the house was quiet, whenever he could catch her alone. Sometimes in the kitchen. Sometimes in the storage rooms. Once in the family's private chapel, an act of sacrilege that seemed to excite him even more than usual. Each time he threatened her with violence if she told anyone. Each time she endured it in silence, storing every detail, feeding her rage like kindling to a fire that would eventually consume everything. But rage alone wouldn't save her. She needed knowledge. She needed power. She needed the spirits to teach her how to become the weapon her grandmother had promised she could be. The spirits answered her prayers, but not in the way she expected. They answered through dreams that began in July of 1788, dreams so vivid they felt more real than waking life. In these dreams, her grandmother would appear, not as she had been at the moment of her death, beaten and broken by the raiders, but as she had been in her power, standing in her priestess robes with her head held high, strings of sacred beads around her neck and wrists. Her grandmother would speak to her in Yoruba, teaching her things that Yamaya had been too young to learn before the raid, prayers and rituals, the properties of herbs and roots, the ways of calling on the orishas for specific purposes. Her grandfather would appear too, teaching her which herbs brought love and which brought death, which words of power could bind and which could release, how to read signs in the natural world, how to know when the spirits were near and listening. These dreams were so detailed, so complete, that when Yamaya woke she could remember everything. Every word, every gesture, every plant and its properties, every prayer and its proper intonation. It was as if her grandmother and grandfather were reaching across the barrier between the living and the dead to give her the knowledge she would need for what was coming. She began to pay attention to the plants in the markets where she was occasionally sent to purchase supplies. Mexico City's markets were amazing places where indigenous, African, and European botanical knowledge mixed together. There were herbs and roots she recognized from her grandmother's lessons. There were new plants native to this land that indigenous healers used. There were imported spices and substances from Europe and Asia. She learned which vendors sold what she needed. She began saving copper coins, the tiny amounts she earned when other households hired her to do laundry on her rare free days. With those coins she bought small quantities of herbs, roots, powders. She hid them in the room she shared with the other enslaved women, wrapped in cloth and tucked into cracks in the walls. Maria de la Cruz noticed the changes in Yamaya, the intensity in her eyes, the purposeful way she moved, the sense that she was carrying something heavy and secret. One night, she pulled Yamaya aside and asked her directly, "What are you planning, child?" Yamaya looked at her mentor, this woman who had shown her kindness when she needed it most, and decided to tell her a partial truth. "Don Carlos has been forcing himself on me. Since March. Many times." Maria's face crumpled with pain and anger. "I knew something was wrong. I should have watched you more closely, should have tried to protect you." "There was nothing you could have done," Yamaya interrupted. "This is not your fault. But I need you to know that I'm not going to accept this forever. I'm learning things. The spirits of my ancestors are teaching me. And when the time is right, I'm going to make them pay. All of them. Not just Carlos. All of them." Maria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said softly, "I recognized what you carry in you from the beginning. You've been marked by powers I don't fully understand. In my village before the Spanish came we had women like you, women who could call on the old gods, who could heal or harm with their knowledge. The priests killed most of them, called them brujas, witches. But some of the knowledge survived, passed down in secret. She paused, then added, "Be careful, Mija. This kind of power, it demands payment. Everything has a price. Make sure you're willing to pay it." "I've already paid more than anyone should have to," Yemaya replied, her voice hard. "Now it's their turn to pay." In September of 1788, Yemaya realized she was pregnant. Her monthly bleeding stopped. Her breasts became tender. She felt nauseous in the mornings. She knew immediately that the child was Carlos's. She had never been with any man willingly, and he was the only one who had forced himself on her. She told Maria first in the darkness of their shared room, her voice barely a whisper. Maria held her while she cried silently, knowing that tears were a luxury that could attract unwanted attention if anyone heard. "What will I do?" Yemaya asked. "If he finds out, if his father finds out." "We can end it," Maria said softly. "I know herbs, ways to make the womb release what it holds. It's dangerous, but—" "No," Yemaya said, surprising herself. "Not yet. Let me think." She spent days in turmoil, praying to her grandmother's spirits for guidance. Part of her wanted the baby. It was a life, and despite everything, despite how it had been conceived, she felt connected to it. But another part of her knew that a baby would make her more vulnerable, would give them more power over her. The decision was taken out of her hands when her pregnancy became visible and could no longer be hidden. One of the other servants noticed and reported it to the housekeeper, who reported it to Don Rodrigo. Such things had to be known and managed. Pregnant slaves affected household management, and Don Rodrigo ran his household with meticulous attention to detail. Carlos was summoned to his father's study. Yemaya was brought there too, forced to stand while they discussed her as if she weren't present, as if she were an object that had malfunctioned rather than a human being. Don Rodrigo asked his son directly, "Did you touch this girl?" Carlos didn't hesitate. "She seduced me, father. These African women, they use witchcraft, bewitch men into sin. I'm ashamed to admit she got her claws into me, but I'm not the first man to fall victim to such wiles. She probably got herself pregnant deliberately, thinking it would give her some advantage." Don Rodrigo turned his cold eyes on Yemaya. "Is this true? Did you seduce my son?" Yemaya looked at Carlos, saw the smirk on his face, the absolute certainty that he would be believed, that her word would mean nothing against his. She thought about denying it, about telling the truth. But Maria's warning echoed in her mind, there would be no justice for her. If she accused Carlos directly, she would be beaten, maybe killed, and nothing would change. So she lowered her eyes and said nothing, which Don Rodrigo took as confirmation of his son's story. "Very well," Don Rodrigo said coldly. "You will be punished for your sin. 20 lashes. And when the child is born, if it lives, it will be sold to the plantations in Morelos. You will not be allowed to keep it and corrupt it with your witchcraft. Do you understand?" Yemaya nodded, still not looking up, her rage burning so hot inside her chest that she thought she might burst into flames. The whipping took place the next morning in the courtyard, with the entire household assembled to witness. This was meant to be instructive, a demonstration of what happened when slaves stepped out of line, when they forgot their place, when they dared to reach above their station. They stripped Yemaya to the waist and tied her hands to the orange tree near the fountain, the tree whose blossoms had perfumed the air when she first arrived in this house. The overseer, a mestizo man named Jacinto who managed the household slaves, carried out Don Rodrigo's orders. 20 lashes with a leather whip, each one tearing into the flesh of her back, each one meant to remind her of her powerlessness, of her place, of who owned her body and her life. Yemaya did not scream. Not once. She had learned from the middle passage that screaming gave them satisfaction, that silence was the only resistance available to her. So she took each lash in silence, her mind traveling to that place where her grandmother and grandfather waited. But this time that place was different. This time they weren't just comforting her or teaching her. They were showing her something, images of herbs mixed together, of words spoken in a particular order, of how to call on powers that could stop a heart, that could create visions of terror, that could drive a man mad. They were showing her how to become the weapon. By the 15th lash, her back was ribbons of torn flesh, blood running down her skin and soaking into the waistband of her skirt. By the 20th, she had lost consciousness, but not before the knowledge her grandparents were giving her had been fully transferred. They cut her down and dragged her to the servants' quarters. Maria de la Cruz cleaned the wounds with salt water and herbs she knew would prevent infection, comfrey and calendula and yarrow. She wrapped Yemaya's back in bandages made from torn sheets and sat with her through the night, changing the bandages when they soaked through with blood, praying in Nahuatl to her own gods to save this girl who had already suffered so much. For 3 days Yemaya burned with fever. She was delirious, speaking in Yoruba to spirits that Maria couldn't see but somehow felt in the room, a presence that made the air feel thick and charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Maria heard her calling out names, Yemaya, Okan, Oya, Shango, and recognized them as the names of the African gods that the priests condemned as demons but that Maria had learned were simply different faces of the divine, different ways of understanding the powers that moved through the world. On the 4th day the fever broke. When Yemaya opened her eyes, Maria saw immediately that something fundamental had changed. The girl who had closed her eyes 3 days ago was not the woman who opened them now. Something ancient and powerful looked out through those eyes, something that made Maria cross herself instinctively even though she wasn't sure if she was warding off evil or acknowledging the presence of something holy. Yemaya tried to sit up and gasped with pain as her torn back protested the movement. Maria gently pushed her back down. "Don't move yet. Your back needs time to heal." "How long has it been?" Yemaya asked, her voice hoarse from fever and dehydration. 3 days. We thought you might die. But whatever gods you pray to, they're not finished with you yet. Yemaya closed her eyes again, and Maria saw tears leaking out from under her eyelids. "The baby?" Maria's face fell. "I'm sorry, Mija. You lost the baby on the 2nd night of the fever. Your body, it was too much stress, too much trauma. The womb released what it held." Yemaya felt grief crash over her like a wave. Despite everything, despite the horror of how that child had been conceived, despite knowing that losing it spared her from having it torn from her arms and sold, she had felt connected to it. It had been a life. And now it was gone, another piece of herself stolen by these people who believed they owned her. But beneath the grief was something else, something colder and harder. A certainty that settled into her bones like frost. She would make them pay. All of them. Every person in this house who had allowed this to happen. Every family like them who built their fortunes on the bodies of enslaved people. Everyone who participated in this system of casual cruelty and considered it normal, righteous, blessed by God himself. "Maria," she said, her voice gaining strength, "I need you to help me get well. I have work to do." Maria looked at her with a mixture of fear and understanding. She knew what kind of work Yemaya meant. And despite her own fear, despite knowing that helping Yemaya could bring terrible consequences if they were discovered, she nodded. Because Maria had her own griefs, her own losses, her own rage at a system that had ground down her people for nearly 300 years. If this African girl had found a way to strike back, Maria would help her. Yemaya's recovery took months. The scars on her back healed into thick ridges that would mark her forever, a permanent reminder of the price she had already paid. But something else was happening, something the other servants in the household began to notice and whisper about. Strange occurrences started happening around Yemaya. Candles would spontaneously light themselves when she entered a dark room, flames springing to life without anyone touching flint to tinder. The orange tree where she had been whipped, which had been blooming beautifully with white flowers that perfumed the entire courtyard, began to wither. Within a week of her whipping, every leaf had turned black and fallen off, and the tree stood dead and skeletal, as if it had been struck by lightning or cursed. Don Rodrigo ordered it cut down, disturbed by the omen. Mirrors in the house began to crack for no apparent reason. First one in the main hallway, then another in Don Rodrigo's study, then a third in the dining room. Each one developed a spiderweb of cracks radiating from the center, as if something had struck them from behind, though no one had touched them. Dogs in the neighborhood would whine and hide when Yemaya walked past them on her rare trips outside the house. They would flatten their ears, tuck their tails, and refuse to come anywhere near her, as if they could sense something about her that humans couldn't see. And Yemaya's dreams intensified. Every night, her grandmother and grandfather came to her with more knowledge, more teachings. They showed her how to identify dozens of plants and their properties, which ones stopped the heart when prepared correctly, which ones created visions of terror, which ones induced madness. They taught her the prayers and invocations that called specific orishas for specific purposes. They showed her how to create powders that had no taste and no smell, that could be added to food or drink without detection, that worked slowly enough that no physician would connect them to their source. Most importantly, they taught her patience. Revenge rushed was revenge that failed. She needed to be methodical, careful, thorough. She needed to make sure that when she struck with certainty and left no evidence that could be traced back to her. By December of 1788, Yemaya had gathered everything she needed. She had stolen small quantities of herbs and roots from the kitchen stores, things that Maria helped her access. She had purchased other ingredients from the market with coins she had saved. She had learned from other enslaved people which vendors were sympathetic and wouldn't ask questions about unusual purchases. She had ground and mixed and prepared, following her grandmother's instructions with exactness, creating a powder that was her first weapon. It was derived from a mixture of plants, some African, some indigenous to the Americas, some European, all working together to create something that would stop a heart while leaving no visible signs of poison. A physician examining the victim would find nothing unusual, would attribute the death to heart failure or perhaps a sudden stroke. Don Rodrigo Velasco de Mendoza fell ill on December 15, 1788. It started with a dry cough that he attributed to the cold weather that had settled over Mexico City. Then came a fever, then an increasing weakness that made him tire easily. The finest physicians in the city were summoned. They examined him, took his pulse, studied his urine and blood, and pronounced that he was suffering from a corruption of the humors, a common diagnosis that meant they had no idea what was really wrong. They bled him, trying to remove the corrupted blood. They gave him purgatives to clean his system. They administered mercury mixed with honey, a standard treatment for many ailments. Nothing helped. In fact, the treatment seemed to make him worse, weakening a body that was already failing. Don Rodrigo continued to decline through December and into January. His robust frame wasted away. His skin took on a gray pallor. He could keep nothing down. Every meal he ate came back up within an hour, leaving him weaker and more dehydrated. He suffered from nightmares when he managed to sleep, dreams that left him screaming and clutching at the air as if trying to ward off something only he could see. The household whispered that he was being punished for his sins. Some pointed to the dead orange tree as an omen. Others noted how all the mirrors had cracked, another bad sign. The more superstitious servants suggested that perhaps the African girl he had ordered whipped had cursed him with African magic, but these suggestions were quickly silenced. To speak such things openly could bring accusations of witchcraft on the speaker as well. Don Rodrigo died on January 15, 1789, weighing barely 90 pounds, his body consumed from within. The official cause of death, recorded in the parish register, was putrid fever and corruption of the vital organs. The priest said masses for his soul. His sons dressed in mourning black. The household went into the formal period of mourning required by custom. Anya Maya, serving at the funeral meal, watched Carlos Velasco de Mendoza accept condolences as the new head of the household, and she knew that this was only the beginning. Carlos inherited everything. The mansion, the plantations in Morelos, the shipping interests, the warehouses full of goods, the dozens of enslaved people his father had owned. At 27 he became Don Carlos Velasco de Mendoza, master of one of the great houses of New Spain, a man of wealth and influence who answered to no one except perhaps the viceroy and God. His first act as head of the household was to sell Maria de la Cruz to a hacienda owner in Querétaro, 3 days' journey from Mexico City. It was a vindictive decision. He had seen how close Maria and Yamaya were, and he wanted to isolate Yamaya, to remove her only protector and ally in the household. The morning Maria left, she embraced Yamaya in the courtyard and whispered in her ear, "Be careful, Mija. Whatever you're doing, whatever path you're walking, remember that power always demands payment. Don't lose yourself in revenge. Remember who you are." Yamaya nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. Maria was the only person in this new world who had shown her genuine kindness, who had treated her as a human being rather than property. And now she was being sent away, another loss in a life that seemed composed entirely of losses. But Yamaya had learned that every loss fed her power, every grief sharpened her purpose. She would not forget Maria's warning, but neither would she turn aside from the path her grandparents had set her on. Carlos's second act as head of household came that very night. He appeared at Yamaya's room in the servants' quarters after midnight, drunk on brandy and the intoxication of absolute power. He dismissed the other women who shared the room. They fled gladly, not wanting to witness what was about to happen. And then he took Yamaya again, more brutally than before, whispering in her ear while he violated her, "You're mine now. Forever. I own you. And when I'm tired of you, I'll sell you to the silver mines in Guanajuato where you'll die in the darkness within a year. But until then, you're my property to use as I please." But this time, Yamaya didn't retreat into her mind. This time she stayed present for every moment, feeling every violation, cataloging every detail, feeding her rage with fresh fuel. When Carlos finished and left, she lay on her mat in the darkness and spoke aloud to her grandmother's spirit. "I hear you, grandmother. I understand. This is why I survived. This is what you preserved me for. I am ready. Show me how to destroy him." And her grandmother's spirit answered, not in words but in visions that filled her mind, showing her exactly what to do, what ingredients to use, how to prepare them, when to administer them, how to make Carlos Velasco de Mendoza pay for everything he had done. The next morning Yamaya went to work in the kitchen. The new head cook, a mestiza woman named Josefa who was terrified of the African girl after all the strange occurrences in the household, stayed out of her way. Yamaya had been gathering ingredients for months, hiding them in various places around the servants' quarters and the kitchen storerooms. Now she brought them together. She worked with the precision her grandmother had shown her in dreams, grinding specific herbs with a mortar and pestle, mixing them in exact proportions, adding a few drops of liquid from this vial and a pinch of powder from that packet. The result was a powder that had no odor, no taste, that dissolved completely in liquid, that would take days to have its full effect. She added a small amount to Don Carlos's morning chocolate. He drank it without noticing anything wrong. He went about his day, reviewing account books with his late father's secretary, meeting with the overseer about the plantations, dining with friends who came to pay their respects and congratulate him on his inheritance, visiting his mistress in the San Angel neighborhood, because of course he had a mistress in addition to the enslaved woman he regularly raped. But that night Carlos began to feel strange. His heart raced for no reason, pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He couldn't catch his breath, as if the air had become too thin. He felt as if ants were crawling under his skin, an unbearable itching sensation that made him want to tear off his own flesh. By dawn he was in the grip of full terror. He saw things that weren't there, demons with burning eyes standing in the corners of his room, watching him with patient hunger. He saw his father's corpse standing at the foot of his bed, rotting and maggot-ridden, pointing an accusing finger at him. He saw a dark-skinned woman with scars on her back who laughed at him with her grandmother's voice, who whispered in a language he didn't understand but that filled him with existential dread. He screamed and clawed at his arms until they bled, trying to get the crawling sensation out from under his skin. He ran through the house naked, knocking over furniture, breaking precious objects, shouting about demons and curses and African witchcraft. The physicians were summoned. They examined him and found his pupils dilated, his pulse racing, his body drenched in sweat despite the cool January weather. They diagnosed nervous fever, perhaps an imbalance of the humors brought on by excessive grief for his father. They bled him. They gave him sedatives. They tied him to his bed when he became too violent. A priest was called to perform an exorcism, because several servants had whispered that perhaps Don Carlos was possessed by evil spirits. The priest came with his holy water and his crucifix and his Latin prayers, but nothing helped. Carlos continued to scream and thrash and see things that no one else could see. For 3 days and 3 nights, Carlos Velasco de Mendoza lived in hell. The visions never stopped. The sensation of things crawling under his skin never ceased. His heart raced and raced until his body simply couldn't sustain it anymore. On the 4th day his heart gave out. He was 27 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as nervous fever and exhaustion of the vital spirits brought on by excessive grief. Yamaya was serving breakfast to the remaining members of the household when they brought Carlos's body down from his room. She watched them carry the corpse wrapped in sheets, and she felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a cold certainty that justice had been done and that she was nowhere near finished. With both Don Rodrigo and Don Carlos dead within weeks of each other, the Velasco de Mendoza fortune passed to Carlos's 2 older brothers, who had been managing the family's plantations in Morelos. They arrived in Mexico City for Carlos's funeral, concerned about the strange circumstances of both deaths but not yet suspicious enough to take any action beyond increasing security. The older brother, Francisco, was 32 and had inherited his father's shrewd business sense. The younger of the two, Antonio, was 30 and had a reputation for even greater cruelty than Carlos. His plantations in Morelos had the highest mortality rate of any in the region because he worked enslaved people literally to death during harvest season and simply bought new ones to replace those who died. They took possession of the mansion and all its contents, including the enslaved people. They held a family meeting to discuss consolidating their holdings and decided to keep the Mexico City house as their city residence while continuing to manage the plantations from Morelos. Yamaya watched and listened and waited. Patience, her grandmother reminded her. Patience was the key to revenge done properly. Francisco Velasco de Mendoza died 6 months later, in July of 1789. The official cause was a mysterious fever similar to what had killed his father. He had been healthy one day, then developed a cough, then a fever, then began wasting away just as Don Rodrigo had. By the time he died 3 weeks after the first symptoms appeared, he weighed barely 100 pounds, his body consumed from within. The physicians were baffled. They noted the similarity to Don Rodrigo's illness but could find no source of contagion. No explanation for why this particular family seemed to be cursed with this wasting disease. Antonio Velasco de Mendoza died a year later, in August of 1790. His death was different. He fell down the main staircase of the mansion and broke his neck. The official ruling was accidental death, though several servants later whispered that they had seen him suddenly jerk backward at the top of the stairs, as if pushed by invisible hands, though no one was near him. With all three sons dead, the Velasco de Mendoza line ended. Don Rodrigo had no other children, and his nephews were distant relatives who inherited portions of the fortune but not the house or the name's prestige. The mansion was sold. The plantations were divided among creditors. The enslaved people were dispersed to other households. And Yamaya disappeared into the vast network of enslaved and free people of color in Mexico City, carrying with her the knowledge that her grandmother's gods had not abandoned her, that they had given her a weapon against those who believed they were untouchable. One house down. 6 to go. Over the next 9 years, Yamaya moved through Mexico City like a ghost, like a dark angel of death that the great families couldn't see until it was too late. She worked briefly in various wealthy households, never staying long enough to be memorable, always moving on before anyone could connect her to the misfortunes that seemed to follow in her wake. She discovered that she wasn't alone in her suffering, that the 7 great houses of Mexico City had left a trail of broken lives across the entire colony. Every wealthy household she entered had its horror stories: enslaved women raped by their masters, indigenous servants beaten for minor infractions, children born of these violations and sold away from their mothers before they could even speak, workers on plantations and in mines and workshops dying from overwork and neglect. She met other women like her, survivors of unspeakable violations who carried their rage like a secret fire. She learned their stories. She remembered their names. And she began to see a larger pattern in how the 7 great families were interconnected, how they intermarried to consolidate wealth, how they protected each other's interests, how they considered themselves a breed apart, chosen by God and history to rule over the darker-skinned masses of New Spain. Yamaya decided that if God had chosen them, then the Orishes had chosen her to be their divine punishment. The second house to fall was the Iturragare Arostegui family, and their destruction began with Don Fernando, whose death at age 23 we witnessed at the beginning of this story. But Don Fernando's death was only the first note in a symphony of destruction that would consume his entire family line. Don Fernando de Iturragare Arostegui was not just a young heir to a fortune. He was the grandson of Don Sebastián de Iturragare, a man who had ordered the deaths of 300 indigenous workers during a rebellion at his textile workshop in Puebla. The workers had been protesting 18-hour workdays, starvation wages, and the use of child labor in conditions that destroyed their health before they reached adulthood. Don Sebastián had responded to their protests by having the ringleaders publicly hanged in the plaza of Puebla and the others beaten so severely that dozens died of their injuries in the days following. The survivors were forced to continue working under the same conditions, with the corpses of the hanged men left swinging in the plaza for a week as a warning. Don Fernando had inherited not just his grandfather's fortune but his cruelty. He was known throughout Mexico City society for his treatment of indigenous and African servants, arbitrary beatings for imagined infractions, impossible demands designed to give him an excuse to punish, cruel games where he would promise a servant their freedom if they could complete some humiliating task, then laugh when they failed. 2 servants in his household had died from beatings he personally administered. A young indigenous woman had thrown herself from the roof of his mansion after he repeatedly raped her and then accused her of seducing him, resulting in a public whipping that left her permanently scarred. These incidents were known but ignored by Mexico City society. After all, masters had the right to discipline their property as they saw fit. Yamaya learned all of this from the network of servants who passed information to each other through whispered conversations in markets, in the separate chapels where enslaved and indigenous people were allowed to worship, in the pulquerias where free people of color gathered. This network was invisible to the great families, but it was vast and efficient, carrying stories and warnings and occasionally, opportunities for revenge. She gained access to the Iturragare household by posing as a laundress, a service that wealthy families hired from outside rather than assigning to their own servants. For 3 weeks, she came every Monday and Thursday, washing the expensive linens and silk garments that the family wore, observing the household's routines with the careful attention of someone planning a military campaign. She learned that Don Fernando drank hot chocolate every morning at precisely 8 o'clock. It was always prepared the same way: imported cacao from Oaxaca, cinnamon, vanilla, a touch of chili pepper in the old Aztec style, all mixed with hot milk and beaten until frothy. The chocolate was always brought to his room by the same elderly indigenous servant, a woman named Xochitl whose daughter had died 3 years earlier from injuries sustained during one of Don Fernando's beatings. Yamaya approached Xochitl carefully, testing her first with small conversations, learning her story, gauging whether she might be receptive to what Yamaya was offering. When she finally revealed her purpose, that she had the knowledge and the means to make Don Fernando pay for what he had done, Xochitl didn't hesitate. "Tell me what to do," Xochitl said, her old eyes burning with a rage that had been banked for years but never extinguished. "My daughter was 15 years old when she died. 15. She had done nothing wrong except exist in his sight. I have prayed every night for 3 years that God would punish him. If you are the answer to my prayers, then I will help you." Yamaya gave her a small packet of powder and precise instructions. "Add this to his chocolate tomorrow morning. All of it. Stir it well so it dissolves completely. It has no taste, no smell. He won't notice. By tomorrow night he'll begin to feel strange. Within 3 days he'll be dead. Can you do this?" Xochitl took the packet with steady hands. "I can do this. I would do far worse if I could." The next morning, Don Fernando drank his chocolate without noticing anything unusual. By noon he was feeling slightly unwell, a headache, a sense of unease. By evening he was feeling actively ill. His heart racing, his vision swimming, a growing sense of paranoia. By midnight he was in the grip of full terror, seeing demons in his room, feeling as if his heart was going to explode out of his chest. He died at dawn on the 3rd day, his eyes staring at something no one else could see, his mouth frozen in that silent scream that would become the signature of Yamaya's work. The physicians examined the body and found nothing. No marks, no poison, no explanation beyond sudden failure of the heart brought on by unknown causes. It was tragic, they said, but these things happen sometimes to young men. Perhaps a weakness of the heart that had been present from birth, perhaps too much excitement and rich food, perhaps God's inscrutable will. But Don Fernando was not the last of the Iturragare line. He had 2 younger brothers and a younger sister, all married into other wealthy families, all equally comfortable with the system of cruelty that their grandfather had established. Yamaya was patient. She waited 6 months before striking again, allowing time for the family to grieve, for the household to relax its guard. The second brother, Tomas, died in what appeared to be a hunting accident. He was thrown from his horse during a hunting expedition in the forests outside Mexico City. His horse was known throughout the city as the gentlest, most reliable mount in his stable, an animal that had never spooked or thrown a rider in its life. But on that day, witnesses said the horse suddenly reared up as if something terrified it, though there was nothing visible that could have caused such a reaction. Tomas fell badly, striking his head on a rock. He died instantly. The official ruling was accidental death. But several servants whispered that they had seen a dark-skinned woman in the forest that day, watching from the trees, though no one could agree on her features or even confirm that she had really been there. The third brother, Rodrigo, succumbed to a wasting illness similar to what had killed Don Rodrigo Velasco de Mendoza. It took nearly a year for him to die, his body slowly consuming itself despite the best efforts of physicians and priests. By the end he was skeletal, his mind confused, seeing visions that terrified him. The sister, Dona Beatriz, proved more difficult because she rarely left her house, and when she did, she was surrounded by servants and guards. But Yamaya had learned patience, and she had learned that everyone had vulnerabilities if you watched long enough and carefully enough. Dona Beatriz had a weakness for French perfumes, expensive bottles imported from Paris at great cost. She ordered new perfumes 4 times a year through a particular merchant who specialized in luxury goods from Europe. Yamaya learned this from a servant who worked in Dona Beatriz's household, a young woman who had been grateful when Yamaya helped her terminate an unwanted pregnancy that resulted from rape by one of the household's male servants. It took 3 months of planning and careful observation to learn the merchant's schedule, to understand when shipments arrived, which servant was sent to collect them, and how they were transported to Dona Beatrice's mansion. It took another month to time everything perfectly, to intercept one shipment, to carefully open one of the sealed bottles, to add her own preparation to the perfume, and to reseal it so carefully that no one would ever know it had been tampered with. She died 4 months after receiving that tainted perfume. The physicians declared it was cancer, a wasting disease that sometimes struck women, particularly those who used too many cosmetics and perfumes with their mysterious foreign ingredients. The priest said masses for her soul. Her husband, a member of the Salcedo y Montemayor family, mourned appropriately. And with her death, the Iturragare-Arostegui line ended. The fortune was divided among distant cousins. The great mansion was sold. The family name, once spoken with respect and fear, became a historical footnote. 2 houses down. 5 to go. The third house to fall was the Salcedo y Montemayor family, masters of vast silver mines in Guanajuato, where thousands of indigenous and enslaved workers died in the darkness underground, their lungs destroyed by rock dust, their bodies broken by the brutal labor of extracting silver from deep in the earth. The fourth family was the Cortázar Benavides, who controlled much of the textile industry in central Mexico and who employed enslaved children in their workshops. Children as young as 7 years old who developed twisted spines and ruined eyesight from endless hours at the looms, who often died before reaching adulthood from the various diseases that flourished in the crowded, unsanitary workshops. The fifth was the Obregón Villarreal, whose haciendas in the Bajío region were infamous for working enslaved people and indigenous peones literally to death during harvest season, then simply buying new workers to replace those who had died, treating human beings as expendable resources no different from draft animals. The sixth was the Dávalos Cervantes family, who trafficked in enslaved Africans, running a network of ships between Veracruz and the Caribbean, specializing in the trade of human beings and profiting from every link in the chain of misery that brought people like Yamaya to the New World. And the seventh was the Zúñiga Fonseca, whose patriarch had personally led the military campaign against indigenous rebels during the Yaqui uprising, ordering the execution of hundreds of men, women, and children as punishment for daring to resist Spanish rule. Yamaya destroyed them all, one by one, with the patience of someone who had learned that revenge was a dish best served cold, systematically, with careful planning that left no evidence and no witnesses who could testify against her. By 1796, Mexico City society was consumed with talk of the curse of the 7 houses. It had become impossible to ignore the pattern. All of these interconnected families were losing their heirs, their sons and daughters dying without producing the next generation. Genealogists noted with alarm that family trees that had flourished for 2 centuries were suddenly ending. Priests spoke from pulpits about God's mysterious ways and the sin of pride. Some brave souls whispered that perhaps this was divine judgment for the system of slavery itself, for the brutal treatment of indigenous peoples, for building fortunes on the suffering of others. It is a story that refuses to end, that continues to echo through time, that speaks to every person who has ever felt powerless and wondered whether resistance was possible. And the answer it gives, in Yamaya's voice carried across more than 2 centuries, is always the same. Yes, resistance is possible. Justice is possible. Change is possible. You are not powerless. Remember who you are. Remember who came before you. Call on the spirits of your ancestors. And when the time comes to strike back, strike with precision and patience and the certainty that the universe itself supports those who fight for their own humanity. That is the legacy of Yamaya Oken, the witch of the 7 houses, the African woman who destroyed the untouchable families of colonial Mexico and in doing so reminded the world that no system of oppression, no matter how powerful it seems, is truly invincible. And as long as people remember her story, as long as candles are lit at her shrine, as long as women whisper her name when they need strength, she remains alive, not in body but in spirit, in inspiration, in the continuing struggle for justice and dignity that she represents. The 7 houses are dust, but Madre Yamaya endures. Please like and subscribe if you like this video.